Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Nun Vav. On the previous daf, we saw a statement by Rabbi Yochanan that boundary markers and sea squill, that's this plant that grows straight up, also the roots grow straight down, so this was used as a boundary marker between different plots of land. Rabbi Yochanan says that this type of boundary marker is sufficient when it comes to acquiring land that belonged to a convert who has no heirs. Since he has no heirs, so there's no one to inherit when he dies, and therefore anyone who comes and takes it can take it. If someone made an acquisition on the left part of the field, then they only acquire that part of the field, not the one on the right of this type of boundary. So this sea squill boundary is considered a boundary for the purpose of acquiring such property. Now there was a machloket whether it also is a boundary for pe'ah and tum'ah. Ravin says that yes, it's also a boundary for those halachot. That's what we were up to. And so all that was by Ravin, and now we follow up with the statement aval l'shabbat law, according to Ravin, even though this sea squill boundary is considered a separation for the laws of acquisition and for pe'ah and for tum'ah, but for Shabbat, we're talking about carrying on Shabbat. We're going to see the case in a second. It is not. That was Ravin's report of what Rabbi Yochanan said. However, Rava Amar afilu le'inyan Shabbat. Rava says that this type of barrier does separate between two different sections, even for the laws of Shabbat. So let's see what the case is. Detanya. Hosi chasi gerogeret l'shut harabim v'nicha v'chazar v'hosi chasi gerogeret acheret be'elem echad chayav b'shnei hedemot patur. This is Tanakama. We're not going to see the case that we need until we get to the Biyoseh. But the basic case is if someone carries a half of a dried fig of food on Shabbat from a private domain to a public domain. He moves it and puts it down. And then he gets another half of a dried fig. It could be actual half a dried fig or that amount of food, another one, and brings it from private domain to a public domain and puts it down. So if it's done within one lapse of awareness, then he has to bring a korban. If it's two lapses of awareness, then he does not have to bring a korban. Let's explain. If someone violates Shabbat by mistake, he was negligent. He didn't realize it was Shabbat, or he didn't know that this was prohibited. So if he does one of the 39 melachot, he has to bring a korban hatat. However, that's only if it's shiur. There's a minimum measurement, and for food, it's a amount of a dried fig. If someone carries less than that, then they do not have to bring a korban. Now, if they bring a half now and a half later, do those halves combine? The answer is it depends on if it was done within one lapse. So he woke up in the morning and didn't realize it was Shabbat. He thought it was Monday. And he brings out a half and then brings out another half. And only after he brings out the second half, then he realizes, oh no, it was actually Saturday. So then he has to bring it because it was within one lapse of not knowing that it was Shabbat. So they do combine. However, if it was in two lapses, he woke up in the morning, he thought it was Monday, he brought one half. Then he realized, oh, in fact, it's Shabbat. Oh, I took out half of a dried fig from the private to public domain. So he remembered. But then later on, he forgot again, and he thought it was Tuesday, and he brought out another half. And then he realized after that, then they do not combine because that's two separate lapses. That's the opinion of Tanakama. Rabbi Yosef Omer behalem ehad birshut ahat hayav b'shtei reshuyot patur. Rabbi Yosef adds another limitation and says that one only has to bring a korban if it was done within the one time lapse of not realizing that it was Shabbat or not realizing that this was prohibited, and he didn't realize and remember in the middle. And it also has to be within one public domain. In other words, he carried it from his house to the same public domain. But if it was two different public domains, then not so. Let's say he has one street in the front of his house and another street in the back of his house, and he carries one half to the front through the front door to the street in front of his house, and another one through the back door to the back street of his house. So he's carrying, although he's carrying twice, but each one was only a half of a fig, and they were taken into, even if it was within one time lapse, but since they were taken into two different domains, so then he is patur. It only combines together if he takes it into the same domain. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Now, what counts as a separation between public domains? Rabba says that it's considered two public domains if there is a private domain in between. That's what he calls chiyuv chatat, something that if you would carry a full fig from one to the other, you would have to bring a chatat. You only bring a chatat if it's from a private to public domain. But a karmelit, which is in between, that's a reshut harabim d'Rabbanan. It's not a big street that everybody's walking back and forth, but like an open field, which is also not a private domain either. So here is a picture of that, of Rabba's opinion, according to explaining Rabbi Yosef. If someone has a reshut hayachid, right? So there's a public domain that's on this side and on that side, but there is private domains that separate them. In that case, if someone brought half a fig to this side, and within the same lapse, half a fig on the other side, then they would not be liable because those are considered two separate domains. However, let's say there was a public domain here and a public domain here, and in between was just a valley, just open space. So that's not considered a reshut hayachid. And if someone would carry, let's say, a whole fig from here to here, they would not be liable to bring a korban because this is only asur midirabanan, and so therefore this would actually combine together. This reshut harabim and this reshut harabim are considered all one because this in between is not a significant barrier. Only a reshut hayachid is a significant barrier that separates. So therefore, if someone was in a private domain somewhere in the middle, but it's not separated by a private domain, and he brought one half to this and one half to that, they would combine, and he would be liable to a korban hatat because he brought from a private domain, reshut hayachid to this, and another one to that one, but this is all the same reshut harabim, because besides his little house here, it's otherwise all combined and only separated by a karmelit, which is not considered a real separation. That's the opinion of Rabbah. Abaye amar afilu karmelit aval pisla lo. Abaye says no, even a karmelit does separate between two public domains, and therefore if he brought half a fig here and half a fig there, he would not be liable even within the same time frame of a lapse of awareness, because even a field, even a karmelit, causes them to separate. However, if it's just a little piece of a small separation, like a piece of wood, that is not considered a separation. And so if he brought from his house, let's say he had a house in the middle here, and he brought it from one fig over here, and one fig onto the other side, those would combine, because this street is considered all one street, one reshut harabim. Just a little beam of wood in the middle is not considered a separation, according to Abaye. Rava amar afilu pisla. However, Rava says even a beam does divide the public domain. So in that sense, he'd be the most lenient in this case, because he would say that even though it's just a beam that's separating them, nevertheless, if he carries to that's considered separation, a boundary marker between the two reshut harabims, and therefore, if he carries half a fig here and half a fig there, they do not combine, and he does not need to bring a korban hatat. So we see that Rava is consistent with what he said up here. Rava says that even for Shabbat, these sea squills or other boundary markers, that is just some stones or some elevation in a mound of dirt, those would all be considered to be a proper boundary marker, not only for the laws of acquiring a field from a convert who died without heirs, and not only for Pe'ah and Tum'ah, but also for Shabbat. So while Ravin said, no, for Shabbat, a boundary marker made out of sea squills is not considered a boundary marker, and therefore, if one carries a half a fig into this part of the field and a half a fig into the other part of the field, that's only separated by sea squills, so that's considered the same reshut harabim, and one would have to bring a korban hatat. However, Rava, who says that a wood beam is considered a boundary marker, also would say that a C-squill barrier is considered a barrier between two Reshut Harabim, and therefore, if it brings a half of a fig to this side and half of a fig to that side of that boundary marker, he is not liable. So that's Rava's understanding here. And Rava has another statement that is consistent with this one, because he also said that the definition of a domain for Shabbat is the same as the definition of a domain when it comes to a get. If a husband wants to give his wife a get, one way of doing it is by renting out to his wife or giving her a section of land. So let's say he gives her a section of land. Let's say this is the land that he gives her, and then he throws the get into the land. So if it falls on the floor somewhere in that field that he's giving her, then she acquires it and she's divorced. But let's say there's a piece of wood, a small piece of wood sticking up, and he throws it onto that. So that is considered a separate domain, and therefore it's not called landing in her domain, but in a separate domain, and she is not divorced. So that's what Rava says regarding a get. So you see that it's the same thing. Just like a beam is considered a separate domain when it comes to a get, and she would not be considered a divorced, so too a beam regarding the laws of Shabbat is considered a separate domain, and that because of that, that boundary marker is considered a significant item such that it separates between the two fields that are on either side. And Sham lo meser velo hasab mai. Now we go back to the Rabbi Yochanan statement. Remember, he said that if there is a boundary marker or some C-squill in between, that is considered a boundary marker for the sake of acquiring a field from a convert. But now we ask, what if there's no boundary marker there, and then someone goes and makes an active acquisition on part of the field? What about the rest of the field, right? How much will they get? Mai perash rab marinos mishemo kol shenikret al shemo. And so Rabbi Marinos said, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, any area that's called by his name, right? This convert, his name was Bob, and so we said that whatever is called Bob's field. So because there's no boundary markers to know what the extent of the field is. So go ask around, right? What is it? Where is this? What is this called? Bob's field. How far does it go? Up to here. So if someone makes an acquisition on one part of that land, they'll get all the land that's called his name. Hechidame amara papa de karule be garguta de planya. So what's an example? The papa says that which they call the place that's irrigated by the well, Gadguta is a well of that guy. So Bob has a well, and you say, oh, this is the whole area that's irrigated by Bob's well. So that's considered his land because he irrigates it. Yatev Rav Acha bar Avia kamed Rabbi Aseh, v'yatev ka'amar mishmed Rabbi Aseh bar Chanina, Chatzuva mafsik benichseh hager. Rav Acha bar Avia was sitting before Rabbi Aseh, meaning he's sitting as a student before Rabbi Aseh, and he was repeating a tradition that he heard in the name of a different Rabbi Aseh bar Chanina. They have the same first name, but they're different people. They both happen to be students of Rabbi Yochanan and lived around the same time. So anyway, he was repeating to him that Chatzuba, that's the C-squill barrier again, is considered a separation when it comes to the property of a convert who died without heirs, that if one makes an acquisition on one part of the land, they do not get the other part of the land. So we already saw that in the name of other students of Rabbi Yochanan. So here Rabbi Aseh is another student of Rabbi Yochanan, and he's sitting and repeating the same tradition. Mai Chatzuba, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Shebo Tichem Yehoshua l'Israel et ha'aretz. So what is this Chatzuba? What is this type of barrier? That's a C-squill barrier. So Rav explains that Yehoshua used these very plants when he made the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael for the Jews. He wanted to show, here's the outer boundaries of Eretz Yisrael and the boundaries between the tribes. He used this because it's easy. Instead of building a whole wall and everything, you could just plant these trees and these plants, and they go straight down. The roots don't spread out, and they go straight up. They don't spread out. So they're very good and easy to use as boundary markers. V'amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav, lo mana Yoshua ela ayarot ha'omedot al hagebulin. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav that when Yehoshua mentions various cities in the book of Yehoshua, he doesn't name every city where the Israelites lived, but rather he focuses on those cities that are on the borders to emphasize that those are the border towns of the country. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel Kol Shera'u HaKadosh Baruch Hu LeMoshe Chaya B'Ma'aser. So while we're on the topic of various cities in Israel and the boundaries of the land of Israel, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shemuel that everything that Hashem showed to Moshe before his death, Moshe was not able to go into the land, but he said, look, right, and he showed him all the various areas and the peoples that were then in the land of Israel, and he showed him the 7 nations, right? He says, here's this land and that land, Chivi and Perizi, and so on. So all those 7 nations that Hashem showed to Israel are officially part of the boundaries of Israel, such that whatever grows there, you have to give ma'aser. If it grows outside the land of Israel, then you don't have to give ma'aser. So we ask Lapukemai, what's excluded that you might think is in the land of Israel, but is actually not, is to exclude these 3 areas that are mentioned back to Avraham in Brit Ben Abetarim, in those Pesukim, in Bereshit chapter 15, Pesukim 18, 19, 20, 21. It actually mentions 10 different peoples, and these 3, Keni, Kenizi, and Kadmoni, are mentioned there for Avraham, but they are not mentioned to Moshe as areas that are part of the land of Israel. And therefore, although they are promised to Avraham, Avraham is granted bigger boundaries in the future that will be descendants of Avraham, and these are people that are allied with Israel, but they are not part of Eretz Yisrael proper. And so while they're allied, and so Avraham is blessed with that in the future, but Moshe has not shown that because that's not where the official tribes have inherited, and therefore they are not liable to Ma'aser. Now, where are these 3 places? There's a few different opinions. Tanya, Rabbi Meir Omer, Naftucha, Arba'a, V'Shalma'a. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Har Seir, Amon, Umoav. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ardiskis, Asya, Ve'Aspamya. So there's 3 different opinions in this Baraita among the Tanaim about how to identify the Kenizi, and Kadmoni. That brings us to the next Mishnah. Hayu shenai me'idin oto shachala shalosh shanim. V'nimseu zomemin. Mishalemin lo et hakol. In order to establish a chazakah, we're going back to the regular chazakah of 3 years. One has to bring witnesses that, in fact, that squatter was on that field and consumed from that field for 3 years in a row. So let's say 2 witnesses come and testify on behalf of a certain squatter that he was there for 3 years. And let's say this land is worth $1 million. And so the squatter is claiming, I bought it from you for $1 million. And see, I have witnesses. But then it turns out that those witnesses were mzomemin. Not only that they were lying, but they could not possibly have testified that this guy was on this land. This land is in Israel for 3 years, because those very witnesses were living in Canada for all those 3 years, and there was no possibility that they could have seen this guy on the land for 3 years. So these Edim Zomemin were trying to remove property from the original owner that's worth $1 million. They were going to cause him a $1 million loss. And the law of Edim Zomemin is that they have to pay themselves that which they tried to cheat out of the rightful owner. And therefore, those 2 witnesses will have to pay $1 million as their punishment. Shenayim barishona, shenayim basheniya, ushenayim bashirishit, meshaleshin benehem. Now, let's say you don't have 2 sets of witnesses one set of witnesses for all 3 years, but rather 3 different sets of witnesses. You have 2 people that testified, I saw this guy, the squatter, on this land in year 1. And then 2 more witnesses say year 2, and 2 more witnesses talk about year 3. And turns out that all 6 people are found to be Edim Zomemin. All 6 of them were in Canada and could not possibly have seen this happen. Then they collectively have to pay with the $1 million. Each set of witnesses will have to come up with $333,000. Shelosha achin ve'echad מסתרף עמהן, הרי אלו שלוש עדויות, והן עדות אחת להזמה. Now let's say it's the same scenario, except that instead of being six different people, there's three people who are brothers and one other person. Each of the brothers testifies about 1 year, and the other unrelated person testifies about all 3 years altogether. So, if you have such a case, even though two brothers together cannot testify because two brothers are related to each other, so they cannot make a group of witnesses. However, a brother with a stranger that's not related for year 1, that works for year 1, and then a second brother who's testifying about year 2, that works for year 2, and so on for year 3. So therefore, this can work as 3 testimonies, and because they're talking about 3 separate times, 3 separate years, so therefore each of those testimonies is valid. And so if they're found to be true, then that will create a chazakah, even though they are talking about brothers, but each of the brothers is testifying about a different year. And so therefore it's acceptable as testimony. And furthermore, if they're found to be edim zomin, that these 3 brothers and that other witness all were in a different country that whole time and could not have testified, then they will be edim zomin, and they will have to pay the $1 million. The stranger who testified about all 3 years will have to pay $500,000, and the 3 brothers will each have to pay a third of the other $500,000. Matnitin de la Rabbi Akiba detanya Amar Rabbi Yosef Keshalach Abba Chalafta Esel Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri l'mod Torah V'amri la Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Esel Abba Chalafta l'mod Torah Amar lo. This Mishnah is not the opinion of Rabbi Akiba, as we will see in the following Baraita, because Rabbi Yosef taught that when his father, this is Rabbi Yosef's father, Rabbi Chalafta, so it's Rabbi Yosef Bar Chalafta, he says that my father went to study with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Or others say it was the other way around. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri went to study with Abba Chalafta. Either way, these 2 people who were studying from each other, one from the other, one said to the other, "Hareh she'achala shalosh shana rishona bifnei shenayim, sheniya bifnei shenayim, shedishit bifnei shenayim mahu, amar lo hareh chazaka." One of them asked the other, let's say you have 2 witnesses that testify about year 1, that the squatter was there, and another 2 witnesses testify regarding the 2nd year, and a different 2 witnesses regarding the 3rd year. Can they all join together to make a 3-year chazakah? And the other person, whichever way it was, said, yes, that is a chazakah. That is the same as the opinion in our Mishnah. Amar lo, afani omer ken. So the other colleague said, I agree with you. Ela Rabbi Akiva cholek v'dabar zeh. They were the same generation of Rabbi Akiva, and so even though these 2 sages who were talking to each other agreed with each other, but the one mentioned to the other that Rabbi Akiva does not agree with this. Shaya Rabbi Akiva omer davar velo chasi davar. Rabbi Akiva learned from the pasuk that when at the mouth of 2 witnesses or the mouth of 3 witnesses, yakum davar, that the matter will be established. So that means that it has to be 2 witnesses that testify to an entire matter. Whatever it is that makes the person guilty or proves that this is his, it has to be the one set of witnesses that testify to the entire thing. If you have one set of witnesses that testifies to half of it, and another 2 people testify to the other half of it, then they don't combine. You can't combine testimony of different people. You have to have one set of witnesses that testify to the entire event, occurrence, the entire matter. So Rabbi Akiva would say, well, this wouldn't work. You need 2 witnesses that are there all 3 years and can testify as such. You cannot combine, because the first set of witnesses, all they know is that this guy squatted for 1 year. That by itself would not work. And so, if you add them all together, it works, but that's not sufficient. Whoever is making the testimony has to be able to testify to all 3 years. That was Rabbi Akiva's opinion. So now for the other sages who say that it does work in our Mishnah, and these 2 sages that say you can combine 2 witnesses for year 1 and for year 2 and 2 other witnesses for year 3. So what are they going to do with this pasuk? What will they derive from the davar? That has to be one matter that the witnesses testify to the entire matter and not half a matter. what will they apply it to? So let's maybe we can apply it to the following case. This is regarding testifying that a girl, we want to know if she is considered a minor or an adult. It depends on her physical development. They have to see 2 hairs in her private areas in order to establish that she's an adult. So let's say you have one witness that says, I saw one hair on the front side, on her abdomen on her front side. And one said, on her gabaz, her back side. And one says, I saw on her front side near her abdomen. And so with that, can they combine together? One saw one hair, one saw one hair, but they're different hairs because they're on different sides. So will that combine together to be testimony? No, obviously not. No one would think that, because here you only have one witness that saw one thing and one witness that saw the other half of the thing. So that definitely cannot combine. So that wouldn't work. Rather, the Rabbanan would apply this law to 2 witnesses that saw one hair on her back and 2 witnesses that saw one hair on her front side. That you might think would work, and that's why you need davar to say not so. In other words, if it's one witness and one witness, then for sure there's no testimony at all here. There's not testimony for the front and not testimony for the back. There's nothing even to combine, because one witness doesn't count for anything. But if it was 2 for the front and 2 for the back, so well, if you combine them, then that does make up 2 hairs. But that's why we need davar and not davar to exclude this. So everybody would agree that this case of 2 hairs would not combine. Now, what's the difference between this case and that of the 3 years that do combine? The difference is that when it comes to 3 years, there's no way that that witnesses can see all 3 years at the same time. By definition, there's a time factor, there's a lapse between the first year and the second year. So no matter what, even if it's the same set of witnesses, they're going to see the first year during the first year, and the second year during the second year. So because there's a time difference between what they're seeing, no matter what, so therefore that can be split up into separate witnesses. That's fine, because both witnesses are there at the same time, seeing that relevant time span of the year 1 and the relevant time span of year 2. So you can combine separate witnesses who are seeing things at different times when the testimony requires something that is seen over a long period of time. That's different from the hairs, because the hairs have to be seen at the same time, and they can be at the same time. They both have to exist there. And so therefore you need one set of witnesses that says, we saw 2 hairs. Then that's good. That's a normal case. But one set of witnesses that saw one and one set of witnesses saw the other, that does not combine. So you cannot combine 2 witnesses to 2 different aspects of a simultaneous event, right? Yeah, they have to see that that you need one set of witnesses. But if it's an event that takes time, like the 3 years, then you can combine various sets of witnesses. One more law in this regard. Amar Rav Yehuda, echad omer achala chitim v'echad omer achala seorim, harezo chazaka. Rav Yehuda says that in order to establish a chazaka of 3 years, let's say you have 2 witnesses that say, yeah, we saw this guy consuming for 3 years. However, one of the witnesses says, I saw him consuming wheat. The other one says, I saw him consuming barley. Now, there seems to be a contradiction between the 2. Nevertheless, they do combine, because they're both in agreement that he was consuming something on it. Maybe they got confused, they saw it from far, whether it was precisely wheat or precisely barley, but they both agree that he was consuming something during that time. So that's sufficient. That's Rav Yehuda's opinion. Matkif la Rav Nachman, Ela me'ata echad omer achalaha, rishona shelishit v'chamishit, v'echad omer achalaha, sheniya rebi'it v'shishit, hachinameh tahavya chazaka. So Rav Nachman challenges Rav Yehuda. Wait, so according to you, that you can combine one witness and another witness, even though they're saying something slightly different, what if one witness says, I saw him using the land years 1, 3, and 5. And the other one says, I saw him using the land years 2, 4, and 6. So would you also combine those together and say, oh, see, yes, he was there for 6 years straight, which is even more than you need, because you're combining them together, even though they are different? Obviously not. No one would say that. But that's Rav Nachman's challenge. How come you would combine wheat and barley and combine those two witnesses to be one, even though they're saying different things, and you would not combine one witness that says even years and the other one that says odd years? Amar le Rav Yehuda, hachi hashta hatam b'shata dekamasid mor la kamasid mor. Harcha tarvayu bechada shata kamasid mesahade. Ma'ikal memar ben chite leseare lavadatai de enashe. So Rav Yehuda says these two are not comparable at all. There, in the case of the years, even years and odd years, at the time that one witness is testifying about, the other is not testifying about that time. And so they're testifying about two different time periods altogether. So obviously they cannot combine. Whereas here, in my case of wheat and barley, they are both testifying about the very same time period. So yes, they can combine. Now, what's your problem? Because one says wheat and one says barley, they're not paying attention so closely. They saw it from far. They couldn't tell from far whether it was wheat or barley. So the point is that they're saying it's a grain. And so again, here, there's an important distinction between combining testimony that spans time versus combining testimony that's at the very same time. And so if it's spanning, this is actually in the way the opposite of the previous case, because here, when it's spanning time, because they're talking about different years, so then they don't combine. If they're talking about, so 1 year, there's one witness for 1 year and one witness for the other year, then obviously they don't combine. For even years or for odd years, they're not going to combine. But if it's two witnesses for year 1 and 2 year witnesses for year 2 and so on, then that would combine. So that makes sense. And if you have two witnesses that talk about two different items, like one hair and one hair, those do not combine, even though they're talking about the same time period, but they're seeing different things. Obviously, they're seeing different things, so those don't combine. But here, where you have one witness seeing barley and one wheat, that is okay, because it's not, they're both testifying to the same thing. One's just calling it barley, one's calling it wheat, because they didn't look carefully at what it is. So even though it's one witness saying this and one witness saying that, they're talking about the same time, and they're referring to the very same thing. And therefore, in this case, they can combine. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.